Welcome to the EPIA channel. This is the place where we aggregate European security news and try to make it entertaining. Today's video is a tad different to the usual. We'll be talking a little bit about the situation in the Ukraine with regards to the Russian military buildup and the rumors of a new invasion. Unfortunately, Russian aggression towards the Ukraine is nothing new. It's an old story, a sad story. I saw an interesting tweet that encapsulates those feelings. I believe this is often the case. I believe this is how the Kremlin sees the Ukraine. At war in Ukraine for 8 years, invader Russia has its propaganda outlets write Kiev and not Ukraine, deliberately using the Russian imperialist spelling of Kiev. Russian information warfare does not name Ukraine because the Moscow Empire denies Ukrainians are a nation. To the Russian state, Ukraine is merely an extension of Russia. Gone are the days of the Soviet Union, but the mindset is still the same. The aspirations of the empire of the Soviet Russia remains. When talking about the state security of Moscow and Russia as a whole, one first has to understand the geopolitics of it all. So to begin this topic, I found this article by The Atlantic, posted in 2015. It's titled Russia and the Curse of Geography. Do you want to understand why Putin does what he does? Look at a map. This article is by Tim Marshall. So it goes on to say that Vladimir Putin says he's a religious man, a great supporter of the Russian Orthodox Church. If so, he may well go to bed each night, say his prayers, and ask God, why didn't you put mountains in eastern Ukraine? If God had built mountains in eastern Ukraine, then the great expanse of flat land that is the European plain would have not been such inviting territory for the invaders who have attacked Russia from there repeatedly through history. As things stand, Putin, like Russian leaders before him, likely feels he has no choice but to at least try to control the flatlands to Russia's west. So it is with landscapes around the world, their physical features imprison political leaders, constraining their choices and room for maneuver. These rules of geography are especially clear in Russia, where the power is hard to defend and where for centuries leaders have compensated by pushing outward. Western leaders seem to have difficulty deciphering Putin's motives, especially when it comes to his actions in the Ukraine and Syria. Russia's current leader has been described in terms that evoke Winston Churchill's famous 1939 observation that Russia, quote, is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma, end quote. But it's helpful to look at Putin's military interventions abroad in the context of Russian leaders' long-standing attempts to deal with geography. What if Putin's motives aren't so mysterious after all? What if you can read them clearly on a map? For Russia, the world's largest country by landmass, which bestrides Europe and Asia and encompasses forests, lakes, rivers, frozen steppes and mountains, the problems come by land as well as by sea. So let's take a deeper look into the European plain. On the other hand, Russia's vastness has also protected it. By the time an army approaches Moscow, it already has unsustainably long supply lines, which has become increasingly difficult to protect as they extend across the Russian territory. Napoleon made this mistake in 1812, and Hitler repeated it in 1941. Just as strategically important and just as significant to the calculations of Russia's leaders throughout history has been the country's historical lack of its own warm water port, with direct access to the oceans. Many of Russia's ports on the Arctic freeze for several months each year. Vladivostok, the largest Russian port on the Pacific Ocean, is enclosed by the Sea of Japan, which is dominated by the Japanese. This does not just halt the flow of trade into and out of Russia, it prevents the Russian fleet from operating as a global power, and it does not have year-round access to the world's most important sea lanes. The article goes on to speak a little bit about the history of Russia, which is important to understand too. Russia as a concept dates back to the 9th century and a loose federation of East Slavic tribes known as the Kievan Rus, which was based in Kiev and other towns along the Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine. The Mongols, expanding their empire, continually attacked the region from the south and east, eventually overturning it in the 13th century. The fledgling Russia then relocated northeast in and around the city of Moscow. This early Russia, known as the Great Principality of Moscow, was indefensible. There were no mountains, no deserts, and few rivers. Enter Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar. He put into practice the concept of attack as defense, consolidating one's position at home and then moving outward. Russia had begun a moderate expansion under Ivan's grandfather, but Ivan accelerated it after he came into power in the 16th century. He extended his territory east to the Ural Mountains, south to the Caspian Sea, and north towards the Arctic Circle. Russia gained access to the Caspian and later the Black Sea. thus taking advantage of the Caucasus Mountains as a partial barrier between itself and the Mongols. Ivan built a military base in Chechnya to deter any would-be attackers, be they the Mongol Golden Horde, the Ottoman Empire, or the Persians. Now, the Russians had a partial buffer zone and a hinterland, somewhere to fall back to in case of an invasion. No one was going to attack them in force from the Arctic Sea, nor fight their way over the Urals to get to them. Their land was becoming what's now known as Russia, and to invade it from the south or southeast would have to have a huge army and a very long supply line, and you would have to fight your way past defensive positions. As long as a pro-Russian government held sway in Kiev, Russia's buffer zone would remain intact and guard the European plain. In the 18th century, Russia under Peter the Great, who founded the Russian Empire in 1721, expanded the empire westward, occupying Ukraine and reaching the Carpathian Mountains. It took over most of what we know now as Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, from which it could defend against attacks from the Baltic Sea. Now there was a huge ring around Moscow. Starting at the Arctic, it came down through the Baltic region across the Ukraine to the Carpathians, the Black Sea, the Caucasus and the Caspian, swinging back around to the Urals. At the end of World War II in 1945, the Russians occupied territory conquered from Germany in Central and Eastern Europe, some of which then became part of the USSR, as it began to resemble the old Russian Empire. This time, though, it wasn't the Mongols at the gates. After 1949, it was NATO. Now, this is the part where I don't agree. The way it's written is how the Kremlin probably sees the whole situation, which in my opinion is wrong, but I digress. The whole premise of this argument is that NATO is some sort of ruthless entity whose only purpose is to invade Russia. NATO is not a nation, it's not a country, it's an organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's like a club, and most European nations are in this club, for one reason and one reason only, to protect themselves from, you guessed it, Russia. It is, in my opinion, a Russian misinformation campaign which spread the whole myth that NATO wants to invade Russia. No, I don't think it does. If NATO did not exist, I would place all my life savings on the fact that Russia would already be occupying Georgia, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland, if not even more of Europe. Even post-World War II, Russia had made its way into east of Germany, and that expansion only halted in 1989 with the fall of the USSR. So Russia wants to spread itself as far as possible, like an octopus. It does not seem to keep the status quo. Alone, European nations are absolutely defenseless against Russia. This is why NATO was created in the first place, to defend against the expansion of Russia and the spread of the ideology which it exports. Attached in the article is an image detailing the size of Russia in certain periods. We can understand something by looking at the size of Russia today compared to Russia in the past. It got smaller. This giant empire lost a lot of territory which was not hers to begin with. By the time the USSR came around at the end of World War II, Russia, or the USSR, had managed to impose itself on many European sovereign nations. Many, like the Czech Republic, made revolutions against Russia. Even as far down as Azerbaijan, people revolted against the Russian Empire. Now Russia is smaller, but her ambitions have not changed. European nations do not expand, only Russia expands. Again, NATO is an attempt to defend the sovereignty of each individual nation from Russia. Also, Russia puts a lot of pressure, trying to prevent Ukraine from joining the NATO alliance. Well, let's go on with the article. Two of Russia's chief preoccupations, its vulnerability on land and its lack of access to warm water ports. They came together in Ukraine in 2014. As long as a pro-Russian government held sway in the Ukrainian capital, Russia could be confident that its buffer zone would remain intact and guard the European plain. Even a neutral Ukraine, which would promise not to join the European Union or NATO, and would uphold the lease Russia had on the warm water port at Sevastopol and Crimea, would be acceptable. But when the protests in Ukraine brought down the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych and a new, more pro-Western government came into power, Putin had a choice. He could have respected the territorial integrity of Ukraine, or he could have done what Russian leaders have done for centuries, with the bad geographic cards they were dealt. He chose his own kind of attack as defense, annexing Crimea to ensure Russia's access to its only proper warm water port, and moving to prevent NATO from creeping even closer to Russia's border. And again, it's written as if NATO is on the border of Russia and NATO is going to encircle Russia and take over Russia. No, again, in my opinion, I think that's incorrect. It's a myth. I think that NATO is being used as a defensive mechanism against the continual expansion of Russia. We've seen Russia go into Georgia. We've seen Russia go into Transnistria. We've seen Russia go into Ukraine, right? Those nations don't have NATO. If they did, perhaps it would prevent Russia from entering those nations. But if you don't have NATO and you're a sovereign European nation, you're under threat if you're bordering with Russia. So, of course, the nations which are bordering with Russia, such as Georgia, such as Ukraine, they're incentivized to join NATO. And Russia, of course, is pressuring them not to join. But look what happens. It makes no sense. And here you can see on this map, actually, which countries Russia is bordering NATO with. It's literally at 3 points. The United States of America, there you have Alaska, which is separated by a little bit of ocean. And then you have a tiny section of border, which is, I think, with Norway. And another small slither of border, which is with Estonia and Latvia. And you can see this small enclave here, which, oh, okay, fine. Russia is really surrounded by NATO there. That's Kaliningrad. And that is a Russia outside of Russia. So I would say that Russia poses the more imminent threat to Europe than Europe poses to Russia. I think I'm just rambling on a bit. I do hope that Russia does not invade the Ukraine. Of course, it'll be a huge tragedy, a huge loss of life. It will cause very big implications for the rest of Europe, the rest of the world. It can also set off chain reactions. For example, China could invade Taiwan with this huge destruction going on if Russia did invade Ukraine. Yeah, so we hope for the best. We hope that nothing does happen. We just hope that nation states can respect other nation states' sovereignty without trying to go back into the past. For example, like justification, oh, we were there, so we should go back there. I don't think it works like that. So yeah, thanks for watching this video. I hope you did find it informative. Please subscribe if you have not yet and give this video a like. It'll help me a lot. If you'd like to stay updated with security news in Europe, be sure to follow me on Twitter. Also, we have an Instagram account, so be sure to check it out. Thanks a lot and take care.